in this new virtual workspace, and how in some places they're doing it really well, and other places it's falling on its face. And what I discovered is that it's falling on its face not because of the technology, but because of the human behaviors and human interaction, and habits, and lack of different interpersonal capabilities. So so it's not a really simple answer to your question. It's just my life's journey, and it's where it's taking me. And now we take that next level of, as we're going to talk about, artificial intelligence and Internet of Things and big data and all of that, and what that then is having an impact on us as human beings.
Sure. So you mentioned virtual reality and education, and that's something I've been really curious about recently, and because I lived in China and I was teaching in China for 7 years.
Wow.
And I know how just fascinated the Chinese are with having someone who is not Chinese teaching their classes, and they'll pay so much money to have someone who's in the United States or in Australia or in England, any English-speaking country, doing lectures for them. So I've always been curious, ever since I got this idea in my head, how long will it take, or will it take off, to have a teacher in the United States teaching for a virtual classroom that's literally like VR for someone in China, or for a classroom in China?
So what's interesting about that is, I don't even know if we're going to have the teachers doing it. There's already English-speaking chatbots in South Korea teaching English to the South Koreans. You know, so it's, here's the thing: what is the value then of the English-speaking human, who probably has a funny accent and pronounces things differently because of their dialect or the region they're from or whatever. No offense to all my Australian colleagues, but when I teach international students whose language is the first language isn't English, they tend to like the U.S. accent, at least more than mine, which is more Midwesterny, as best I can describe it, compared to my Australian colleagues. They often say that. So again, yeah, in terms of VR, I think VR is going to be absolutely fascinating and really, really handy with that virtual reality, almost like your own personal simulator, to be helping us integrate what, I don't like using the term soft skills, because soft skills aren't soft. But human skills, right? The ability to know, let's say if you're a mediator and you're in a situation and you're confronted with a particular scenario, how do you respond to that? And the emotions that are often associated with certain things, or customer service even. So I think VR is going to, at least the 360 video VR in the first, probably, which is the first iteration that's really accessible for many people to develop and create, I think it's going to have a really good impact on that. But yeah.
Very cool. So on your website, you say that you're preparing the workforce for the 4th industrial age, the age of machines and connections. And can you kind of explain that? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. So look, we're in this place where we're still defining what we're living in, right? We had the Industrial Revolution, we had the Information Age, all this stuff. So we're still kind of defining what we're living through right now. But I think his last name is Schwab, from the World Economic Organization, defined it as the 4th industrial revolution. Some are saying 3rd. But what that's looking like is this convergence between the digital, the physical, and there's another, biological, right? So it's this kind of convergence of these worlds where we just didn't see it before. And as machine language and artificial intelligence and all these exponential technologies continue to take off, and that's only one factor, we need to rethink what it means to be human in this age. And the connection part of it, and the reason I have that, is that while technology is a big driver of what's happening, and that's where everybody points to first. They go, hey, all this technology, robots are going to take over our jobs. What they're forgetting is that there are other mega trends that are also happening in our socio-demographic world, and things like we're living longer, right? And so now we have a multi-generational workforce like we've never had before, but not only is it multi-generational, but we have different attitudes. Not that we always didn't have different attitudes as, the younger generations came up, but we have the first generations of digital natives coming into the workforce, and they have new behaviors. And some of those are what they expect from a workplace, what they expect out of their life, how fast they think they should advance. And you couple that with generations who are staying in the workforce longer, because guess what? Like 70s is the new 50 kind of thing. And there's people who still have a lot of things that they want to do, they want to give back. And so we need to figure out how to work with all that. So connection in terms of that, connection in terms of greater mobility. We can work anytime, any place, on any device, pretty much. Further globalization, some would say that we're going a lot more borderless, even though there's obviously resistance to that in various forms. So we have this flux. We're in this huge transition period, going from what was and what had been for the last 100 or so years to something that we're not quite sure what that's going to look like. We have an idea, but this period in the next 30 years, 20 to 30 years, is huge transitions. So.
Well, and I love that you're kind of looking to this future and to all of this change, and you're saying, okay, this is happening. Let's work with it. Whereas I hear people every day who are complaining, and they're saying, oh my gosh, AI is going to take over the world. We're not going to have this. We're not going to have that. And then you hear people even about things that are it's not even news anymore, but Amazon, people are still saying, oh, Amazon's ruining, Sears is going to go out of business unless Sears, changes what they're doing. But there's entire industries being wiped out by this kind of technology. And I think it's important for people to do what you're doing and say, okay, let's work with that. How can we prepare ourselves for what's coming? So what kind of, advice do you have for people that are kind of in that situation where they're afraid, I guess?
Well, gee, look, it's really easy to take a very negative, or what they're saying, dystopian, view of what's happening. And there's always been technological displacement, right? With new technologies, some people lose their jobs. The difference here, and the reality is that it's predicted that it's going to happen at a faster rate than it ever has. And that's the concern. So what can we do? Look, I'm not the only one who, I think I have a little piece of the puzzle. I'm not pretending to have the full solution. And because I focus on learning and training and in the humanness, our human skills, that's where my focus is. So there was even an article, and I'm going to get to the point here, just bear with me. But there was an article I read from the Harvard Business Review online today, and it was talking about that we need to redefine what smart means. Right? And I would couple that with, we also need to redefine what human work is at the same time. And given the advent of artificial intelligence and what we're going to see, the article is suggesting that as we redefine smart, it's not about how the knowledge that we have, but it's more about the higher order thinking skills, our critical thinking skills, things that the Future Institute's also calling novel and adaptive thinking, computational thinking, a design mindset. So it's developing those kind of what we used to call higher order thinking skills, and some are kind of new sets of those, along with our ability to relate to each other and our ability to collaborate and to have social and emotional intelligence. And quite honestly, some of us are already better than that than others, and all of a sudden it's not how much you know, but it's how well you can work with each other. Right? And we as humans, unfortunately, and it's a little controversial me saying this, but we think because we can talk that we can communicate. And we think that because we're actually being productive as a team that we're really relating to each other, or sometimes we know that there's bullies involved, it's maybe very task-based relationship. So there's some work to do there. And so personal development will then turn into professional development. So
that's interesting. So what kind of everyone knows. If they don't know this, then they're kidding themselves. But obviously, we all know that robots or AI is going to be taking over professions and jobs. Um, what kind of jobs do you think are at risk?
Look, what's being said is that anything that is routine based, anything that's routine can be automated in one fashion or another. So what's really interesting, I can show you, if you don't mind, I'll share my screen for a second. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, hang on. Let's do that. I have this, just let me know when you can see it.
Yeah, we can see the screen.
Okay, so the 10 jobs that AI and chatbots poised to eventually replace. Now, this was from almost a year ago, July of last year, okay? And so I've done this as a presentation, and we have a little fun with it. So let's look at the top 10 that this article said. Oops. There you go. So web designer is one. And the AI that's already involved is called the grid, right? I'm not going to go into too much depth, but I'll give you an idea. Online marketer, Persado. Office manager. Now, one would think that an office manager needs to be a human being, but there is an office manager called Betty who's being trialed, or at least had been a year ago, in the UK, and people like doing reception work and greeting and all that stuff, scheduling, they're absolutely loving Betty.
Wow.
Accountants is, I think that's SMAC or SMAC. Now, with the accounting area, my understanding is that, look, we'll still need accountants. We just might not need as many accountants, and they will be doing higher functioning, more interesting work. And that's the kind of thing with most of this, is that we'll still need these professionals, but we may not need as many of them. And the ones that we do retain, they'll be doing very high level and very interesting work where all the routine type stuff will be taken away from them. So there's one for HR, even journalists. Wordsmith is an interesting AI. I haven't looked at it recently, but the last time I checked, you can put Wordsmith in your organization. It will troll through the organization's files and data and everything else, and it will write journalistic articles better than the journalists.
Wow.
You know, in terms of company news and press releases that you would put out. So kind of crazy. Even being an editor, AI is bold. Lawyers, there's something called Ross, and I saw a few months back that one of the first law firms has actually put them in place. Now, Ross doesn't litigate, but what Ross does is that I think they do a lot of the paralegal research and work. So, yeah. And then even a doctor, there's something called Babylon. So this again was from last year. January of last year, they were raising money for this AI to look at all the data. This is where the big data comes in, and what they're predicting for the healthcare industry is that the AI will be able to diagnose you probably better than a doctor, quite honestly. And that's really, I think that's a really positive step forward, where then the doctor can look at the care that's needs for the patient. And things. So those are just some of the jobs, and the misconception, I'll stop my share there. The misconception is that the jobs that'll be taken are just going to be kind of like the working class, blue collar type jobs, like we saw in the first industrial revolution with the assembly line, and that's not necessarily the case. So.
That's really interesting. But and one thing that I always think about when people are bringing this up with me is that, you know, the internet created so many jobs. Who would have imagined that there would be people who are paid to just talk on YouTube? I mean, who would have imagined that before YouTube?
That's absolutely it. And, you know, so while there's going to be a loss of jobs, there's also going to be an emergence of jobs. So it's, again, there's always what they call technological displacement. It's just going to be happening faster. And so we do need kind of a catch-all in society to help transition people, but it's also a great age for entrepreneurs. right? I tell my students, I tell my kids, like I have 7 kids, and I tell my kids, yeah, I know, it's crazy, huh? I said, you have everything at the fingertips to create a business, an online business at least, and there's so much information out there on YouTube as an example, that if you need to know how to do something, well, go to YouTube first at least, and then if not, there will be someone that can answer you.
Yeah, that's so true. So I saw something reading in your bio about how there's, how do you train the workforce when we don't even know what the jobs are going to be? What kind of skills should we really be working on to be ready for the future?
Again, this is what we need to look at some people are calling them portable skills or future-proof skills. I'm calling them futurabilities. And this is really about you as a person. And I see that there's 2 different types of knowledge. One is disposable knowledge or technical knowledge, which changes, right? How you write a press release today is, the format is a bit different than how I learned to do it 20 years ago, but the underlying skill of writing clearly is still a portable skill, regardless if I'm writing a press release or an email. So that's just one example. So there's this disposable knowledge or technical knowledge that changes as things change, and then there's this sustainable knowledge and this deep-rooted understanding and capabilities. And so it's really about working on ourselves, and so some of those are like this notion of resilience, and it's not necessarily something that's easily trained, although I'm working on it, and I'm sure there's some psychologists out there who do resilience training, right? But it's this notion that we need to understand how to adapt and be comfortable with that. And different cultures are actually not as good with that as other cultures, just based on our cultural propensities. So that, and Hofstede talks about the uncertainty avoidance. So some of us and some of our cultures are really high on that level. We'll do anything to avoid uncertainty, where others we're much more tolerant of ambiguity, and we roll with the punches. And it's those people who can roll with the punches who are going to probably roll better as we move on. But we've got to find that in ourselves. And look, the number one there is, I think we need to just continually learn, and learning how to learn, and having a mindset, a growth mindset, as they talk about. And it's those things that will really make a difference in the future. It's the stuff that the unis used to talk about as generic skills. It's like, it's all those critical thinking and those perseverance and those reliability and all these kind of person skills that we get from doing the more technical knowledge, learning the more technical knowledge. But those are the ones that we take here, every place we go and throughout life.
So another thing I'm really curious about, working in this field of technology, I'm a little bit curious about what that looks like in Australia. Is a woman in that field, is that pretty common?
Well, again, just to slant it, I'm not necessarily in the tech field. I'm on the margins. So
okay.
I'm looking at the technology as it relates to society and how we do relationships and things. So I think Australia and the US are fairly similar in nature. They're just different enough to be annoying if you're in one or the other places, because you almost, when everything's so much the same, the things that are different, you're like, well, why is it different, right? And but there's a lot of fairly similarities in terms of the structures and where you find people. So with women, less women in the IT space in the US, it's a similar factor here, but it happens all around.
Okay, that's really interesting. And what about someone who's now maybe younger and they're just getting a degree, or maybe they're just picking out, what should I study? What should I get my degree in? What do you think you would recommend, knowing that, the future is changing pretty rapidly?
Look, I'd recommend a few things. Everyone's talking about the STEM areas, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. And I think having an understanding of those, or one of those, is probably really important. But we also need to recognize that we're not all cut out to be STEMs people, right? So one of the things that they're talking about in terms of the future that's going to be hugely important, one of these skills that we didn't talk about is, again, this is the Future Institute who put this out there. It's called transdisciplinarity. And the idea is that we understand more than one discipline. In the past, we've been very, very narrow in what we studied, and we're just a marketer or we're just a biologist. And this notion is, if you can, let's say, understand engineering, you don't have to do it, but you can understand engineering, but maybe you are a biologist, being able to talk the talk would be really helpful. Or maybe you're a journalist who has a really good firm grasp of technology, right? We kind of see that happening already. But it's different than, transdisciplinarity is different than people like the marketer, the finance person, and whoever getting together and working on a project. That's great. But it's really when they understand in each other's disciplines and have some exposure to that. So I definitely think computational thinking is one of those areas. We're talking about data more and more. Honestly, I'm a qualitative researcher, and while I can do quantitative research, it was never my thing, and I probably made a mistake there. So having some grounding in that notion would be really helpful. But again, try to think or dream about what's not even there yet. There are, and I'll throw it up here on the screen again. There's some jobs that they're talking about that will be, or titles, jobs of the future. I'm just going to share this with you, that aren't quite invented yet. But even things like, I talked to a guy the other day who is like a drone. He's creating a whole business from drones, right? And that's not something we thought about before. And he wants to use it for emergency services, which is pretty neat. Just so you see here, these are some of the titles that people are suggesting of jobs that might exist in the future. Chief marketing technologist. So again, that is very much to do with the data. We already have user experience designers. This notion of a learning experience designer, and that's, I believe I've always been one of those as opposed to an instructional designer, and that's really looking at not just how do we instruct people, because people don't necessarily want to be instructed. They want to have a learning experience, and what that all entails, and what all the tools in the toolbox are available to you. But even this, because remember we talked about longevity, people are living longer, there's this whole end of life planner, right? That's not really STEMs, right? It's very human, it's very caregiving, and those are fields are also going to be very important. Autonomous transportation specialists, right? So people who are working the autonomous cars or taking care of them in the background. Maybe a virtual reality experience designer, drone manager. So there's all sorts of things that we haven't really thought about, but they converge a number of different types of industries. Even the second one from the bottom on the right here, the cryptocurrency bankers, regulators, and lawyers, like Bitcoin and some of the other cryptocurrencies that are emerging. That whole field, I can't even wrap my head around right now. But that's where your kind of accounting could maybe merge with technology and something like that. So it's kind of fun, like you mentioned at the beginning, kind of like Jetsons, right? And as a kid, I didn't grow up with Jetsons. I was watching the reruns too, but we're seeing so much of that now emerge. So imagine 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Exactly. And of course, all of us, at least all of us Americans, I don't know about our listeners, or I think we were all disappointed last year when, was it last year or 2015? I can't remember, when Back to the Future didn't happen.
That's
and
right.
We're supposed to have flying skateboards.
Yeah. Well, but there's some hoverboards out there. It's just not mainstream, right? So kind of crazy stuff. And that's the other thing. I sometimes speculate. I go, okay, or is it, how much hype is really going on? And I'm old enough to remember the big hoo-ha right before the the century change from 99 to 2000, and the Y2K, and our computers were going to explode, and all sorts of things, and nothing happened.
Yeah.
And people made a lot of money being consultants leading up to that. So sometimes I wonder, how much hype is there? The reality is yes, all this tech is happening, and all these other mega trends are happening, but honestly, we have government and policy, and there'll be human resistance to a lot of things. So it may not proceed quite as fast, but upcoming generations might, experience it when they're in their 40s a bit more.
Actually, you brought up government, and one of our listeners just asked a question about that. She says, okay, definitely she thinks she'll lose her job in the future and all the other occupations that might be replaced. So she was wondering, are governments going to be against this situation and kind of get involved?
Okay, well, no, these are good questions, because we got to take a bird's eye view, right? I mean, not only do we say what is human, what does it mean to be human and do human work, right? We also need to say, how do we take care of each other? What does that look like? And I don't know if governments are necessarily going to be stopping it, but I do think that as a society we need to be having conversations. Like, one of the conversations some governments are having and even trialing is this notion of a universal basic income, so that regardless of your income level, that everyone gets a certain amount of money, and to pay for rent and food, right? I mean, universal basic. And what's being suggested is that not everyone's going to lose their jobs, but maybe your job will go from 38 or 40 hours a week to 15. So you need something to pick up the difference, or until you can reskill. So that's one possibility of how we can take care of each other. I think I saw something recently, the Hawaii just passed the fact that they're going to do a universal basic income. And
Really?
absolutely, but they're still going to figure it out. I think there's a pocket of a community or two in Canada where they're trialing it, and so there's that. So that's just one. That's just one possibility. I like to think that if we start looking at creating or recreating our communities to make them more sustainable, right? To we bring down the cost of living, because if we have solar power or whatever it is, to making that energy cost next to nothing, and we look at creating community gardens and using our current resources differently, that cost of living will come down, which means we have less need for as much work, right? So there's a lot of different solutions that are being bantered about, but it is something that we need to be talking about and thinking about, but not we need to try to remove the fear from it, because we don't, as human beings, we don't tend to make good decisions when we're afraid, right?
Sure.
So but talking about it, coming up with cool ideas, and then implementing them.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Bitcoin a minute ago, which I've gotten really interested in cryptocurrencies this week in particular.
Oh,
unrelated to this webinar, but kind of on a similar topic.
Yeah.
So if you know anyone who's really into cryptocurrency and could kind of explain it for the layman, I think that we should talk about that later.
Sure, I might know one person, but I don't know what their level is, but I think it's definitely more than mine.
Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. And
it
one
really
of
is.
one of the things I found really fascinating about it was that it's you can lose the money just like you can lose cash. And you can try to hide your cryptocurrency, your Bitcoin, by programming it and hiding it. And you can actually bury it to the point where you can't find it, just like if you buried gold and you can't find your gold. And you can lose it. You can have your little cryptocurrency on a little USB drive, and you could lose that and it's gone forever, just the same way if you lost your wallet. So it's very interesting to me.
Yeah, it sounds like you know a bit more than I do.
One very intense podcast that I listened to. 2 hours of, cryptocurrency, but still, it's very overwhelming and very interesting. Ruby said thank you for answering her question about the government involvement. And does anybody else of our listeners have any questions that you would like to ask? What you think, how it might affect you, how it might affect the younger generation? Any questions, I'll just throw them out there. Sometimes they don't like asking questions right up until I say, okay, we're done. And then they send 5 or 10 questions at the same time. I'm like, guys, where were these questions 10 minutes ago?
Yeah, what was happening?
I know. Okay.
So,
How old is your youngest?
5.
5, and the oldest is
25. So we have a blended family,
oh.
and I inherited the first 4.
Okay.
Since Ayla, who's 25, was 9. So, but like any good inheritance, they're all my beautiful, amazing children.
Sure.
And then, yeah, and then we had, my husband and I have 3 together. So biologically, my oldest is 16. Okay. So 16, 13, 5. But yeah, we got 25, 23, and the 20, he just turned 20, 18, and then right down. So it's always an interesting household. But it's also part of the reason why I'm really interested in where this all goes in the future, because it's their future, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
And another thing I'm curious about as a mother with a 5-year-old is, what is your stance on technology around the kids? Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm probably going to be unpopular, but we've had the technology in their hand since they were little. Well, especially the 5-year-old. So when he was born in 2011, and so right around just about at 18 months old, he could get my iPhone and swipe and get in, because I didn't have it locked. I learned my lesson a few years later, by the way. But anyway, and then at 2 years old, he could swipe, get in, and find his educational apps. And at that point, he'd been using it for probably about a year. And by 2 years old, he could count to 20. He knew all of his shapes, even like a hexagon. He could not only know his ABCs, but he could sight recognize them out of order. He knew all of his colors, and honest to goodness, it wasn't because I was working with him, honestly. And so that was really, really exciting. And he could even sight recognize me at 30 months, about at least maybe a word or 2, but that was about it. And then it was about that time he found entertainment games. And then it was a bit of a struggle to get him back to the others, but we still had him doing online puzzles, online coloring, and he also did normal, traditional kind of coloring and working with his letters and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't like he just did that, but I find that I have to limit it. Right? So because they will, whether it's a television like when I was a kid, or being on the internet or a computer, they will be on it all day. And but what I found really fascinating up into this age, even at 3 and 4, he would love going on to YouTube, and he would love watching cake decorating. You watch cake decorating videos, and it was just like, are you for real? You're like 4. And and now if we let him, he'll go and watch Minecraft videos, or like, what? You're watching people play with games. We're watching people play with Play-Doh. Go play with the Play-Doh, right?
Yeah.
So there's pluses and minuses with everything. I know there's some people who are very, nope, my kids aren't doing it.
Yeah.
And I see the merits in that, but I think for me, it's a balance. It's a balance.